reading from Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 to 11. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. After the mention of God resting after his creation was completed in Genesis chapter 2, we read about the Sabbath for the second time in Exodus 17 when manna was given. They were asked to collect their food on the sixth day for the seventh day as well. They would not find it outside, said the Lord. It was God's way of saying that you should cease from your activity to do good to yourself and enter into God's rest. The next mention of the Sabbath is here in the fourth commandment. A few things to note in this commandment. Number 1, they were asked to keep the Sabbath day holy, meaning set apart. Number 2, 6 days they were asked to do their work. Notice, it is the work pertaining to you. Number 3, the Sabbath or seventh day is a rest to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, meaning your work that you are doing the rest of the 6 days. 4, Sabbath was unique in the sense that God completed and accomplished his creation purposes. Number 5, Sabbath was unique because God rested on it from all his creative labor. Of course, that does not mean that he was tired and required rest and sleep. We read, God neither slumbers or sleeps, says the psalmist. God's rest means he ceased from his work of creation because it was all perfectly accomplished. He had done all that he meant and perfectly expressed all his creative intent to the point of redeeming the lost creation. Number 6, he blessed the Sabbath and made it holy, meaning he set apart the day as a sign of his satisfaction with all that he had finished making and a sign that no more needed to be done. When we come to Exodus chapter 31 and verse 17, the Lord speaks of the Sabbath as a sign between God and the people of Israel. We read there, it is a sign forever between me and the people of Israel, that in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. So just like circumcision was a sign of the covenant between God and Abraham's descendants, celebrating the faith that that had resulted in Abraham's righteousness, the Sabbath was a covenant between God and Israel for all generations. It was pointing to the rest of God into which he calls his people. His works are completed from the beginning of the world. In order to understand this, we need to go to Genesis chapter 2. On the sixth day, God created man, and the creation was completed, and God looked at all that he created and said it was very good. Man, who was created in the image of God on the sixth day, was created as a being capable of worshiping and enjoying God. The very first day in his life was a day of rest. It was God's desire that all his creation enter into a place of rest. We do not see any command to Adam to observe the Sabbath day as a day of rest. But we know that before the fall, he was given the garden to keep and to tend, without sweat and without toil, but as a part of God's provision for him. It was when sin entered the world through Adam's disobedience to God that work became laborious and toilsome, because he had now to earn his living rather than depend on God's bounty. He was no longer in the garden where food was there for the gathering, but outside where he had to bring food for himself by growing it from the ground or gathering it from the wild bushes. It was by the sweat of his brow that he would get his food. Many centuries later, God instituted the Sabbath rest as a sign to Israel that his people are called to enjoy rest from their own work, to participate in God's sense of accomplishment. God is never in haste, for he knows his work is already done. This is true rest that God's people are called to enter. The people were asked to turn from their own self-reliant labors back to depending on God for their daily bread. We show this attitude of faith by an act of deliberate dependence, ceasing our own necessary labors, ceasing from ourself and ceasing from sin. This was achieved through Jesus Christ. In Hebrews chapter 3, the writer mentions the condition of Israelites. Though they were saved from the bondage of Pharaoh, they did not enter the rest of God. So a change of place could not bring them to rest. From Mount Sinai onwards, the Israelites began to observe the Sabbath. But that too was not enough to bring them into rest. Their bodies fell in the wilderness. In the next chapter of Hebrews, we read that Joshua also could not bring them rest. It was because of unbelief they could not enter the rest. So rest is not a change of place, nor observance of a day of holy rest, where we try to earn God's approval by keeping away from all designated work. Rather, it is an experience of laying down our work in trust that God will look after the world and he will provide for us even when we do not work. The Sabbath is acting on that belief. Adam, before his fall, experienced the rest in Eden because his work was simply an extension of the beautifully finished garden that he lived in. He worked not as a matter of survival, but simply in obedience to the word of God. Today, God offers everyone the chance to enter his rest by trusting in Jesus Christ, the word of God who expresses the heart of God. We need not add anything to what the Lord has done on the cross to achieve our salvation. But we can live in faith, not to earn our salvation, but simply to return to our destined place of trust and obedience. We no longer need to labor so that we may be accepted by God, but we can lay down our self-effort once and for all, trusting that the one who was sanctified and sent into the world for our salvation has accomplished it all and accomplished it perfectly. For this reason, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high, showing that nothing was left to be done for our eternal salvation. That doesn't mean that we are to be lazy. Jesus asked the Pharisees, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill? But they were silent. And he looked around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart. Jesus emphasized that it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. We read how Jesus bore witness to the fact that his Father was always working, even though Genesis says that he rested. Thus, there is a way to work without toil, a work that is simply the outcome of obedience to the Lord's command and not to ensure our own survival. Paul says in Ephesians chapter 2 that we are created for good works. This is the work that faith produces. It is not a desperate striving for God's approval. Instead, it is a response of faith, a restful activity that is aimed at God's delight, a work where God's purposes are carried forward in mercy, justice, and faithfulness. We rest from the need to prove ourselves, to earn our living, and ensure our security for one more day, if not for the rest of our lives. Now we live by the word of God, in the obedience of faith that is aimed at blessing others as the Spirit of God directs. Work now becomes a means to provide for the helpless of our family and the fellowship of believers. Paul said in his parting message to the Ephesian elders in Acts chapter 20, verse 35, he says, I have showed you all things, how that so laboring ye ought to support the weak, and to remember the words of Jesus Christ, how he said, it is more blessed to give than to receive. The proof of such a Sabbath is joy and peace. As we learn to delight ourselves in the will of God, our inner light grows and floods our entire lives with more and more of the knowledge of God, which is joy and peace. This is the proof that we are living in the Spirit, that we are making the right effort to enter His rest. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 9 and 10. There remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For anyone who enters God's rest also rests from his own work, just as God did from his. Let us therefore make every effort to enter that rest, so that no one will fall by following their example of disobedience. God bless.